Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is the secretive organization detailed in our source material. They're sometimes called the Society, sometimes the Order. This is the powerful group whose operations led to that rather dramatic abduction of Lucille and their pursuit of Mr. Sabin, the Duc de Suspigny, all the way from New York to London. So the central question we're grappling with is really about power and perhaps competence. Did this society's methods, their particular brand of international intrigue, pose a genuine, an existential threat to Mr. Sabin and Lucille? Or conversely, were their operations fundamentally clumsy, maybe even inept, and ultimately rendered sort of impotent by the specific environment of British law and society?
I'll be arguing today that the society demonstrated immense, serious power. They successfully generated real terror and achieved several catastrophic consequences for their targets.
And I'll be presenting the alternative view. While their intent was certainly lethal, I think their execution was consistently clumsy. I'm going to argue that the Society's operations just proved incompatible with the British setting, rendering their rather dramatic threats largely hollow, especially when facing a highly capable opponent like Mr. Sabin.
Okay. My core claim really rests on the tangible negative outcomes experienced by the targets. I mean, the society successfully manipulated key political and personal events, proving its reach and its danger were, anything but theoretical. First off, they achieved their initial goal, extraction. Lucille was successfully removed from Lenox, taken against her will, and held captive in London, specifically at Dorset House. This was against her express wishes and her ties to her husband. She explicitly told the prince, "I am forced to leave my husband." Now, that action alone demonstrates their overwhelming initial coercive power, right? Successfully overriding domestic bonds, international borders. And beyond that coercion, the society employed genuinely lethal measures. Let's consider Dustin's death in Mr. Sabin's hotel room via the Essentrausen poison. Now, yes, the initial attempt to kill Sabin failed. I concede that.
But the execution flaw, I think, is secondary to the successful creation of an absolutely ironclad blackmail scenario. The resulting threat of implication in that murder, even if it was accidental or suicide, was strong enough to completely terrify Lucille into planning to flee with Reginald Brought. And finally, they successfully inflicted political ruin. They nearly destroyed Brought's career, forcing him into a political compromise, joining Leatherham's party, which he himself admitted was an apostasy and a profound betrayal of his political base. That demonstrates the society's reach into national power. They didn't just target individuals, they were influencing the very structures of power.
I understand the appeal of that interpretation. You're focusing on the high costs, the political fallout, but when we step back and look at the whole operation, the society consistently failed to neutralize its primary target, Mr. Sabin. They showed, I think, a crippling inability to adapt their traditional sort of underground European methods to the transparency and, crucially, the legal structure of the English environment. I mean, look at the very start, the operation in America. Sabin himself characterizes their initial espionage efforts in New York as painfully primitive. They planned this public arrest on the Campagna, a move that should have been catastrophic for him. But Sabin circumvented it simply by, taking a trip to Washington and contacting the English ambassador, claiming protection. That reliance on the rule of law, on diplomatic channels, completely derailed their elaborate plan. It shows a fundamental failure of operational secrecy and reach, proving that their power, which really relies on the darkness of intrigue, couldn't withstand the light of diplomatic intervention. Then, in the subsequent London phase, their field operatives were, frankly, hopelessly clumsy. Horser and Skinner, the men tasked with following Sabin, were easily outmaneuvered. Even a cabman they employed ended up providing Sabin with crucial intelligence. The entire operation continually failed to maintain secrecy. The attempt to use Emil Saxta's services to get the poison, that immediately exposed the plot's nature to Sabin, and Lady Carey, one of their key agents, was tracked almost effortlessly. Crucially, and this is key for me, the prince himself, their leader, admitted strategic failure. He regretted that England lacked the, quote, soil for intrigue, noting that the police system here is incorruptible, and he concluded with that very telling phrase, I am sorry that we did not leave this country altogether alone. The society's own leader recognized their methods were institutionally incompatible with the territory.
That's a fascinating point about the prince's retrospective pessimism. And I do agree that the British soil didn't perhaps suit their more subtle methods. However, focusing solely on the final outcome, I think ignores the immense pressure the society applied during the process. Sabin was forced to divert his entire itinerary. He was compelled to go to Washington to invoke the aid of the English ambassador, specifically because the judicial threat they prepared to deploy, a warrant for arrest on some ridiculous charge, as he called it, was credible and disruptive enough that he couldn't simply ignore it. His evasion doesn't negate the gravity of the legal weapon they prepared. If anything, it confirms he perceived it as a serious threat.
But this threat, serious as it felt, was successfully neutralized by basic, procedural countermoves. That suggests weakness, not overwhelming strength. Sabin's immediate actions, engaging the ambassador, claiming his protected rooms at Holland House, even tracking Mrs. Peterson's departure via a luggage porter, indicate the society was always, crucially, a step behind. And what about that warning note they sent him? Just scrawled across paper telling him go back to Lennox? I mean, if they truly held such overwhelming power, why essentially beg their target to retreat? That sounds more like desperation, not authority.
Well, perhaps a test of resolve, demonstrating they had the resources to follow him and make demands. But let's move to the most tangible evidence of their lethal capability, Dewson's death. This proves intent, doesn't it? They possess the estranzinsin poison, described specifically in the material as silent, the most secret, the most swift. Dewson died. That proves they could acquire, transport, and deploy a lethal agent, even if it hit the wrong target this time. And the subsequent maneuver demonstrates, I think, effective psychological control, which I'd argue is just as powerful as outright assassination in this context. They used Lucille's implication, her secret procurement of this rare poison from Sachs, her clandestine visit to Sabin's room, to apply immense pressure. The prince successfully exploited this damning circumstantial evidence to force her compliance, to force her planned flight. That leverage wasn't clumsy. It was successful, targeted psychological warfare that effectively kept her captive for weeks.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy the successful leverage argument when the centerpiece of their plan, the poisoning itself, failed utterly to achieve its primary objective, killing Sabin. The weapon misfired, lethally, but it killed their own agent. How is that success? And perhaps even more damagingly, Dudson's actions revealed a critical moral fissure within the society. His suicide note clearly states he was terrified into killing himself, precisely because he refused to become a murderer. He explicitly says, "The poison was given me for you, but I have not the courage to become a murderer." This shows the society isn't the monolithic, ruthless organization you're describing. They employ people who apparently have a moral line they won't cross, and that weakness crippled the operation at a crucial moment. Furthermore, Sabin was already ahead of them on this. He had already provided the police detective, Passmore, with information suggesting the entire poisoning was suspicious and likely foreign lead. He proactively neutralized the society's primary blackmail power before they could even fully deploy it. Sabin relied heavily on the environment, noting that the English policeman stands for cold Anglo-Saxon laws, adamant, incorruptible. This contextual awareness, I think, explains why the poison plot, a kind of quiet European political murder tactic, was inherently inappropriate and ultimately ineffective as a blackmail tool in London. You simply couldn't make a political murder disappear there the way you might in, say, other European capitals at the time.
While Dewson's letter certainly highlights a weakness, maybe a failure of nerve or morale within their ranks, we cannot just dismiss the profound threat to Lucille. Even with Dewson's posthumous admission clearing Sabin, the sequence of events, Lucille's secretive, highly compromising actions, created a situation of such deep peril that she genuinely believed her only recourse was flight. Remember, the prince didn't need to actually convince the British police. He just needed to convince Lucille that prosecution was a real possibility. And that fear clearly was crippling for her. And let's quickly return to Brat's situation. Because this isn't just internal psychological drama affecting Lucille, this is external, verifiable political damage. Forcing a radical politician like Brat to join the opposition, Leatheringham's party,
is a profound victory for intrigue, however you slice it. It completely undermined his public integrity, his entire base. That damage was real. It was public. It's documented in the text. That cost alone proves their power extends beyond merely, well, bungling an assassination attempt.
That detail about Brought is compelling. I grant you, it is a genuine strategic success in the political realm. However, you have to compare that single victory to the repeated systemic operational failure to contain Sabin. Sabin moved freely through London. He openly ignored their warnings, took Lucille out to luncheon at the Milan, and successfully reunited with her without being eliminated. His operational success, his defiance, eventually led directly to the prince's strategic surrender and abandonment of London for South America. And the prince's final attempt to control the situation, this orchestration of a highly complex elopement cover story, involving Lucille and Brought fleeing supposed justice, it just feels like a desperate, overly intricate maneuver. It speaks, I think, to a profound lack of effective direct action capability in England. If they could have simply executed their targets, or effectively silenced them, they surely wouldn't have needed such expensive and frankly melodramatic scaffolding to manage the fallout.
I see why you might characterize it as melodrama, but I think that underestimates the depth of the challenge Sabin actually faced. His reunion with Lucille was constantly under threat. It was never truly secure. Lady Carey continued to actively try to separate them, spreading rumors, even attempting to seduce Sabin herself. And the leverage over Lucille, the psychological hold, was so deep-seated and effective that even when Sabin showed up directly at Dorset House to retrieve her, confronting the prince head-on, Lucille hesitated to leave. She actually told Sabin, "I fear that he is right," meaning right about her needing to remain under the prince's protection. That level of psychological control, even in the face of rescue, that feels like a strategic triumph for the society. So the ultimate failure of the society wasn't simply because British systems were inherently incorruptible, though that played a role. It required Mr. Sabine's high-skilled personal intervention, his diplomatic maneuvering, and the constant loyalty of people around him, including, ironically, the actions of Dasan and Death, and the constant presence of that mysterious man on the steamer, Sabine's protector. If the threat were truly just clumsy and hollow, surely a high-level diplomatic protector wouldn't have been deemed necessary, and Lucille would have walked out of Dorset House without a second thought the moment Sabine appeared. The very fact that Sabine needed such exceptional measures, I think, proves the threat was perceived as, and likely was, existential.
I perhaps come at it from a slightly different angle. The need for those extraordinary measures speaks more to the ruthlessness of the society's intent than the actual efficacy of their execution in that specific context. They certainly intended to be an existential threat, but their actions consistently fell short, constantly undermined by the operating environment and their own clumsy agents. You yourself cited the prince admitting that the English system doesn't suit intrigue, and I think that quote really is the critical summation. The environment itself rendered their standard European power template ineffective. They relied on secrecy and corruption, and both of those failed them almost immediately in London.
Ultimately, the society possessed real instruments of fear and violence, and they deployed them. Deucen's fate proves lethal intent, absolutely. And the political sabotage of Brat shows significant, documented consequences were achieved. They succeeded in extracting Lucille from her home, controlling her movements for a considerable period, forcing Sabin into a complex diplomatic and tactical defense that cost him significant time and resources. Their influence, while certainly messy in its British execution, was, I maintain, anything but trivial. It caused severe, tangible, and personal catastrophe for nearly everyone involved.
Conversely, I'd argue the society's repeated operational blunders, from that primitive espionage attempt right through to the strategic misfire of the poison plot, and the fundamental clash between their methods of European political intrigue and the stolid, incorruptible British systems, meant that their grand threats often dissolved into clumsy melodrama rather than escalating into genuine crisis. Sabin's consistent survival, his defiance, and his eventual rescue of Lucille really underscore the fundamental strategic incompetence of the prince's London operation, forcing him to effectively confess defeat when he said he should have left this country altogether alone.
It seems the source material really forces us to hold two, perhaps conflicting ideas in tension. The undeniable high cost and sheer terror generated by the society's attempts, alongside their consistent failure to achieve their ultimate fatal aims against Sabin.
Indeed. The material presents a really fascinating tension between a sophisticated, ruthless intent and a persistent, environment-driven failure in execution. And that makes assessing the true level of danger incredibly complex. There's certainly more to unpack there, particularly regarding how effective coercion can be, even when the ultimate threat behind it, well, misfires so spectacularly.